Hello there folks, welcome back to the Chaps Guide. My name is Ash and I am your host on this journey through men's style, self-development and personal grooming. Now today I've got a special treat for you. It's one of my Pilgrim's Progress videos in which I meet a very interesting gentleman called Lynn, who hails from the United States of America, who has had something of a remarkable life journey. And we're going to talk about his life journey today. There are many opportunities in listening to the lives of other people where we can take little tips and little bits of advice and incorporate it into our future life journey to make our path to Chap Nirvana a little bit more smooth. Now, today is quite a long video. I've decided to just lay this one out for you. I was going to break it up into segments, maybe different videos on different days. I think that would spoil the continuity of the conversation. So I'm just going to let you have it all. It's quite a long video. Watch it over several different installments if you wish, but please watch it, enjoy it, and learn from the experience of a gentleman of a life less ordinary. Well, welcome everybody to this episode of Pilgrim's Progress here on the Chaps Guide. Now today I've been joined by a special guest from a long way away, another guest from America, and it's Lynn. Now Lynn joins me today from Arlington, Virginia. A state I've never been, actually. I've been I've been to about 20 states in America, but I'm not conscious that I've been through Arlington or Virginia generally. So I very much look forward to coming to visit that state because I know there's a lot to see there. And there's a lot to hear today because Lynn has led a life. And I'm, having introduced him, I mean, as you folks will know, when I sort of navigate these videos, my goal is to get the other person to do all the talking. So this is the most I'm going to talk, other than when I, probe and ask a few questions as we go along. So I've had a chat with Lynn already, and I know there's a lot to talk about today. So Lynn, welcome to the Chaps Guide.
Thank you.
Welcome to Pilgrim's Progress. The question I always ask, tell me about your life.
Well, I should begin by saying Arlington is in Northern Virginia, and we're almost like a separate state. Northern Virginia is about 63% federal employees or contractors, and we're very Midwestern. But if I drive south down to Fredericksburg, we're in the South. Remember the first time I did that, I stopped in to get a cup of coffee, and the waitress had the classic Southern drawl. It was just astounding. My God, I'm only 50 miles from, it's an interesting area to live in, I will tell you that. Very cosmopolitan, very international.
Yeah, I look forward to coming.
It is the highest educated area in the United States. The average education here is a master's degree.
Wow.
And that
out of my depth
includes,
then.
yeah, well, it includes a pretty good size, great number of people who are immigrants from Central America and South America who have no education at all. So there's a hell of a lot of doctors and PhDs and, that kind of stuff. It's an interesting place to live. A brief thing on my life. I was born in 1943. I will turn 81 this year. I was born in Schenectady, New York. My parents were both the first in their families to go to college. They both went to Iowa State. My dad grew up in a very small town in northwestern Iowa called Spirit Lake. There was a guy who wrote a book by that title about the history of the area. And he got a degree in engineering, which a lot of guys did. They graduated in 1940. So they basically grew up during the Depression. And an awful lot of men knew that the way to get a good paying job was to get an engineering degree, which is what he did. And my mom, of course, at her parents' insistence, got a degree in home economics. Was that or nursing or teaching?
Yeah.
Nothing else is allowed. So my dad went to work for General Electric. Their main factory was in Schenectady, and they used to train very extensively. He was there for a year, uh, even got out on the factory floor. I think it was 6 months in the factory, 6 months in test.
Mm.
Uh, so GE didn't want him drafted, and they called up the local draft board and said, "Don't you dare. He's an engineer. They're scarce as hen's teeth." But I was born there. He was working, my mom said he was working 18-hour days.
Wow.
Um, War ended in 45. We moved to Chicago and then up into Michigan, which is where when I was 5. And that's really where I grew up. We lived in Jackson, Detroit, and then finally Lansing for decades.
Mm.
Uh, it was not an easy childhood, I will tell you that. My dad was an alcoholic. He was a binge drinker, which means you don't drink every day. You drink once in a while, but huge quantities and get very, very, very soused. Uh,
Yeah.
my mother had the same problem her father had, and that is that she was bipolar. I used to call it manic depressive.
Yeah.
And she had been abused by her mother and lived in a fantasy world. Um, Unfortunately, at times I was the object of that fantasy, and it made life very difficult.
Mm.
Very difficult. When it came time in 61, when I graduated from high school to go to college, and there was no question about that ever. they they were each the first, and I damn well was going to college, like it or not, and I did like it. I did well in school. Uh, I applied to, I think, 4 schools, and I took the one that was the furthest from home,
How's it
which
there?
turned out to be Columbia in New York City.
All right.
And that was an interesting experience too. But I grew up, I was a voracious reader.
Mm.
Uh, I was not particularly athletic. And there were some things going on with my father with that. His self-confidence was not high. He was from a small town, and there was a lot he didn't know, but it was the 50s,
Mm.
and men solved their own problems. They didn't need any help. They were supposed to be omniscient somehow. It didn't really work, and it left, I think, a lot of men in that era very uncomfortable, leading, and I wouldn't admit it, but I think they were all frightened.
Yeah.
You know, my dad, for example, had no notion of finances. Finances in Spirit Lake were putting money in a savings account,
Yeah.
you know, if you had it. My grandpa did well. I won't say they prospered during the Depression, but they didn't go down.
Yeah.
There was food on the table, rent was paid, so forth.
Yeah.
You know, one of the biggest effects, by the way, of World War II was the home loan program after the war for veterans. This country went from two-thirds renting to two-thirds and up owning,
Mm.
which made
Mm.
quite a difference in lifestyle. Um, so I hit New York City, and I'm from Lansing, Michigan, and not real self-confident, thanks to my father and my lack of athleticism. It's important in high school. The big men on campus were all the football players,
Yeah.
American football, where they, try to kill each other. Uh, God. Oh, it was an interesting class. Uh, what always amazes me is the percentage of the class that never left the area. or maybe, and it's also very interesting the percentage of the class that left, went elsewhere,
Hmm.
and in some cases did extremely well.
Hmm.
Um, so I hit Columbia and New York City, and I had a ball
I
in
bet.
some ways. I was not the best student there. God, I remember sitting down in the freshman humanities course, and the first book we were to read chunks of was the Iliad.
Ah.
And I turned to the guy next to me. I was in Columbia College, which at that time was all men. Now it's co-ed like everything else. Um, and I said, "Oh, this will be interesting. We're doing the Iliad. Last year I read the Odyssey. Uh, good translation." And he looked at me. He had been in a private high school somewhere, and he said, "Oh yeah, we read the Odyssey last year in the original Greek." Thinking, what did I get myself
Well,
into?
put you in your place pretty quickly then.
Woo, man. The interesting thing about New York, of course, is that it's extremely cosmopolitan. You know, in fact, Brooklyn has a greater number of Jewish people than any other city in the world, including Israel,
I was going to say it's probably got more than Tel Aviv.
more than Tel Aviv, about twice, and it ranges from ultra Orthodox to sort of casually Jewish. We celebrate Hanukkah and Passover, and that's it. Uh, and restaurants. I mean, Manhattan, particularly, which is where Columbia is, every block has two or three restaurants.
Yeah.
And if they're not good, they go out of business in 2 weeks.
Mm.
People will eat there once, tell their friends, and they either get a lot of customers or they get none. And it's all sorts of things. And I'm from Lansing, where you can have meat, potato, and vegetable, or meat, potato, and vegetable. Uh,
Bit of a shock,
I
eh?
got very cosmopolitan. Actually, the Upper East or West Side, where Columbia is, um, Chinatown is Cantonese in New York. Okay.
Yeah.
Upper West Side is Northern Chinese, and it's one of the biggest groups of Northern Chinese outside of China.
Mm.
And the cuisine's different, very different.
Mm.
I very quickly found one that I thought was super, and that was a go-to place. Um, my major was Asian studies, Oriental studies, and I studied Chinese. And they started, because I'd go in, I'd talk Chinese. They started treating me like I was Chinese, which means, by the way, you get a better quality cooking.
I bet you do.
You do. Yeah. There's three levels of cooking in a Chinese restaurant in this country. There's Americans who are too stupid to know the difference. There's people who are round eyes, as we say, who speak Chinese and know the culture and appreciate good cooking. And then there's going in with somebody who is Chinese. And if you do that, you get real good
The
cooking.
good stuff, yeah. No cats and
Oh,
dogs in the
yeah.
food there.
Yeah. So I was an interesting place. Columbia is a hell of a university. I mean, it was the Kennedy years and then on into Johnson. Uh, and there were fair number of faculty members who were consulted either directly with Kennedy or with his staff.
Hmm.
It's a very liberal place, needless to say. Um,
Yeah. So that's 4 years you're there, is it?
4 years, yeah.
And that's a bachelor's degree, yeah?
Yes.
Right, because it's 3 years in the UK. I've always been conscious there's a slight difference between
Yeah.
the length
And
of
I, and
time.
I don't know, maybe you go during the summer or something. We have summers off. I
Yeah.
don't know.
So,
Uh,
so it sounds like you had a great time. So what came after university?
in some ways, actually, I want to mention one thing. There were a lot of student organizations on campus that did some very interesting things, and there was one group that tried to get in interesting speakers once a month. And one of the speakers they had in was Martin Luther King,
Oh, wow.
and it was free. So I got there early, stood in line, and got up front. And it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen.
Wow. So you
I mean,
witnessed a piece
in
of history.
person, the guy's speaking ability was just shown.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, I thoroughly, my parents, bless their hearts, are out of Iowa, where there aren't many blacks and they're looked down upon. But they both saw as kids that this was wrong.
Hmm.
And that's what they taught to me. They called it an evil. Okay. That's one of the pluses. Um, but I was also a student of public speaking. I took my first speaking course when I was in eighth grade at age 13. I was shy and I thought it would help. Uh, I don't know whether it helped, but I discovered I have a good voice for speaking.
Hmm.
Okay. I still remember that speech teacher. I bless him every so often. He taught us how to diaphragm breathe.
All
Most
right.
people chest breathe. If you diaphragm breathe, you get a third more capacity in your lungs
Oh.
and you get a more powerful voice. But there was the time we had every once in a while, he'd have a school assembly, we'd read. And I had been reading pretty serious stuff. He said, Lynn, I want you to pick something that's comedy. And I did. And they were in stitches. I had them in the palm of my hand, man, at age 13. And I said, I kind of like this. I think I'll keep it up,
So you
you
discovered a
know,
superpower.
a superpower. That's right. And it's interesting because, at least in this country, it's like 70% of the Americans would rather die than public speak. I mean, literally,
You're right.
die,
It's
for
called
God's sake.
it's called glossophobia, the profound fear of public speaking. And I only know that because when I was in law enforcement, one of my jobs was training. I was a trainer and I used to train public
Sure.
speaking. And I
Yeah.
remember the statistic I opened the course with was that 75% of people in the world would rather die than stand up in front of a group of strangers and have and just speak. And
Yeah.
that is glossophobia. So yeah,
Yeah.
I've always
Yeah.
said being able to speak in front of other people is a minor superpower in this modern world because
Absolutely.
so few people have that ability. So you
Absolutely.
caught on to that quite young. So you
Quite young. Quite
cultivated
young.
it from
And
a young age.
accidentally and almost.
Yeah, came to me very
So,
late. I think I was in my 40s before I picked it up. So
yeah.
university, an interesting time for a for a small town boy. You suddenly get thrust into one of the biggest, most cultural cities in the world. So,
Oh, yeah.
so,
Museums.
oh God,
Oh
yeah. I mean,
my God, the art
I've only driven
museums
through
are
New York. I've,
they're just incredible. Historical museums,
mm,
restaurants. Uh, I went several times to the opera. And I was going when they were back in the old Metropolitan Opera House. They've got a new one at Lincoln Center now, but I was in the old one.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I
Wow.
got turned on to opera, and I can't say, well, it was a course at Columbia. It was my sophomore year. We had the humanities that year was half a year of music, half a year of art. And it was interesting. The art part, our professor happened to be an architect. So he turned us on
Ah,
to noticing buildings.
yeah.
And I've never lost that.
No, it sounds
You
like you had
know,
an interesting time. So, by my reckoning, then, right? So you were in university towards what the mid to late 60s,
mid 60s.
mid 60s.
Yeah, well, early 60s, graduated in 66,
So I know there were things
actually.
happening in America at that time. How did you get drawn into the next phase of your life?
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Um, yeah. My grades weren't quite good enough to get into the graduate schools that I wanted to, and it was Vietnam time. That started in 62 and just kept increasing. By 66, the draft was very active. Um, and I knew they would be after me. So I did what a lot of people did. I avoided the draft, not by, going to Sweden or claiming I was, had a third foot or two heads or something. I didn't try for a medical deferment. I enlisted. If you enlist, you get to choose where you go. If you're drafted, you're going to go in the infantry.
Yeah.
And if you're in the infantry, you're going to go to Vietnam. And there's a fairly decent chance that you're either going to be wounded, perhaps severely. Uh, I have some veteran friends now who were, and or you're going to die.
Mm.
We had 58,000 men die and women in Vietnam.
Mm.
That's enough that practically every town in the country has at least one person who died in Vietnam.
Mm.
That's the impact that it made on this country,
I
among
see.
other things.
Mm.
Um, I don't want to go into a diatribe about it, but um, I was enlisted for 2 years. They sent me to language school. I mean, when I went down from Lansing to Detroit, and there was a sergeant there. I said, I speak Chinese. And he bellowed out to the sergeant major and said, I got a guy who speaks Chinese. I've never had one of those. So off I went to language school and I put in for, I thought, well, maybe I can pick up another language, put in for Korean. They sent me to Chinese and they bumped me forward. Part of the Defense Language Institute is getting a military vocabulary, which I did not have.
Yeah.
And I talked my way into a second course, an advanced course in Chinese, which turned out was good because they would have sent me over to Vietnam, and I would have been over there for Tet of 1968, which is fairly famous as being a good time not to be in Vietnam.
Mm.
Uh,
Meat
and I
grinder.
know exactly where I would have been, and they were attacked rather viciously.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I don't want to go into war stories. I've got a jillion of them, needless to say. Um, I also I wasn't happy with the war when I went in, but I also had a sense of owing something to this country.
Yeah.
Sort of maybe it's a sap to Greek philosophy, owing something to the polis,
Mm.
to my fellow people.
But it's
So I
patriotism.
went. Well, I made sergeant in 18 months, which is phenomenal. Uh, did a good job. And a buddy of mine said, Did you know about the direct commissioning program? I said, No. He said, Yeah, if you've got a college degree, you can apply for a direct commission. And if you've got if you've been doing well, they'll pin the bars on you. No OCS, no ROTC, no nothing. Just, you know, today you are a sergeant, tomorrow you are a second lieutenant. So I applied. I got it. And I wound up actually getting commissioned at the Army contingent of Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo, Texas. But that's another story of bureaucratic nightmare. Uh, Turned out they'd made out papers for that area and not California, which is where language school was in Monterey. and it was easier to move me than redo the paperwork.
Oh yeah.
So I was handed the orders, and there were several things on there. One, you're a lieutenant in military intelligence. Two, you're going to go to military intelligence school for a 3 month course. Three, you're going to Vietnam.
Caught up with you.
Yeah. And I sat there and thought about it. And I still remember thinking about it as I thought, at this moment in history, Vietnam is a monumental event. You have a chance to go and be there. Why not?
Mm,
So I went, you know, and I was in one of the I was in a Corps headquarters. I was not out in the field, but I was in the northernmost one at Phu Bai. We were, 45, 50 miles from the DMZ. And yes, we got attacked in dry season. Wet season, the uh, North Vietnamese army and the VC got smart enough to cross the mountains where it was dry and spent 6 months,
yeah.
But we were getting shelled with Russian rockets every 2 or 3 days by the dozen. They would set them up with time fuses and they would go off at night. Um, Worked hard. Uh, the Corps commanding general was a 4 star, and I wound up. One of my duties was to be the G2, the intelligence briefer for him. Uh, I will say I came home with a Bronze Star for service and an Army Commendation Medal for service.
Mm,
Bronze Star is the fourth decoration down,
yeah.
Medal of
I know
Honor,
it. I know it
Distinguished
well.
Service Cross, Silver Star, and then Bronze Star. And the Army Commendation Medal is the one right after that.
So
Uh,
you had a how long were you in Vietnam for?
Standard tour, 1 year.
One 12 month period. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I can't.
you know the question is coming next, don't you? So were there any lessons that that period taught you that carried
Yes,
forward into your future life?
absolutely. Uh, Actually, one of the more interesting things that happened was the first day of boot camp. I mean, I was, as we called it, a slick sleeve, private recruit. And they took us out on a 5 mile run. And I don't think I'd ever even run a mile. I thought I was going to die. And they had every staff member possible out with the company. And if you fell or collapsed or whatever, they yelled at you to get up and keep going. Well, I kept going. I made 5 miles. The lesson there, and it extends from beyond the physical, is that there's a hell of a lot more inside me than I believed.
Mm,
And if you're willing and have the courage and the belief in yourself, you can reach inside yourself and find your strength.
yeah. Was there any
Absolutely.
was there anything that brought it out with you? How did you sort of manifest it? Because lots of people would give up when they hit that discomfort. They give
They
up.
didn't let you give up.
Oh, they it wasn't your choice. They just propelled you onwards.
Yeah. And I finally, I just decided, okay, they say I can do it, I'll do it. No, yeah, there were other guys, they collapsed 4 or 5 times. I kind of stopped and caught my breath once and they screamed at me and I kept going. And the interesting thing was at the end of basic training, first of all, I was skinny. Okay. I went to college at 125 pounds, 5'10". I was skinny.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
gained about 20 pounds during the years at Columbia. Some of that was a couple of summer jobs I had that were physically kind of active. I went into boot camp at 145 pounds. I came out at 165 pounds, and it was all muscle.
so it worked.
Jesus Christ, excuse me. I mean, good God, man. It
Yeah.
was just amazing. I've never, and I remember it was one of the final days. I know what we had done. We had marched over to turn in our rifles because they put them in a rack and lock them up at night, but you've got them right there in the barracks, and you're always carrying at that time it was an M16, which is heavier than the M14, but you always carry that damn rifle with you every place you went. Oh God, we turned them in. And the sergeant yelled out, he said, "You guys want to just march or shall we double time?" And double time, it's kind of a dog trot, as we call it. And I said, double time. It was 15 miles. We we dog trotted. I wasn't even out of breath at the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had gone that far.
Yeah. You come on a journey. So how long was the basic training period?
8 weeks,
So it wasn't long
two
then.
months.
You've gone from, you know, zero to quite a high level of fitness in well, 2 months.
Yeah, all day, every day.
Yeah, I suppose
If
if
we
you
weren't out on the firing range firing a rifle, or rarely did we sit in a classroom.
you were living the
You
life.
know, there was a little bit of that, but damn little. And
Mm.
we were doing calisthenics, we were running, we were this, we were that, a lot of physical stuff. I ate more than God, they fed us. And the food, I found most Army food to be very good.
Well, yeah. I mean, you put 20 pounds of muscles on over two
Yeah,
months, so that's good going. 10 pound of muscle a month.
that's really good too. But right outside the door to the mess hall, man, there was a chin up bar. You did 12 chin ups, stepped inside, screamed out your serial number, as in Geneva Convention. They want you to have it so memorized you'll never forget it. And then you got to eat, and you always got to go back for seconds.
Yeah, well,
And they
yeah.
did not rush you, you
No,
know.
you've got to be fit to be a soldier, and that's how you do it,
And
isn't
that's how we did it.
it? Yeah.
I remember hearing one of the sergeants. There was a sergeant's table. He said, that food, I don't know where they put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I was off to California. It was the first time I had ever been on an airplane, uh, literally. And it was a Boeing 707. So, right at the beginning of common jet travel.
Mm.
And it weren't my nickel paid for it.
Good old times.
Oh, it was amazing. And we landed in California. Hell, I'd never been in California, you know. And we stepped off the airplane. I remember looking around. It was desert, and there were mountains in the distance. That's how you know you're in California, by the way. You can always see mountains. And not far from where we were lining up, there was a jackrabbit. And he hopped off, you know, and we had an amazing time. We had an amazing time. The Language Institute's one of the nicest bases in the United States Army. I
I would
mean,
have
my
thought so.
God, you're in Monterey, California.
Tough life, eh?
Huh? Yeah, yeah.
Having a knowledge of languages is quite useful, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah, and I discovered at that point because I know a guy who was God, what was he in? Coast Guard Reserve? They're not going to send me to any goddamn school. Well, I discovered that they would not only send me to school, they would house me, feed me, pay a salary, and there was no tuition. And they would give me the books.
What a life.
Well, that's damn near heaven,
It is. That's
you
the way to
know.
get. It's the way to get educated, isn't it? You know, I've been trying to
Oh
tell this to
God,
my son.
yes.
I'm trying to talk my son into a into the profession which will look after him like that too. So yeah.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
so getting back to the life journey,
Yeah.
because we digress. The one thing you said, which I particularly was pertinent for me, was that you recognized that there was an opportunity to be part of history in the making.
Yes.
And, a lot of people put a lot of energy into trying to avoid that, didn't they? They went to Canada or whatever.
Yeah.
But you're a patriot, so you say not so much owe your, you don't owe your country anything, but you're an active participant in the country, so you want to play your part, don't you? So that's something which I
I
took
will
from that as well.
disagree with you on one thing. Yes, I do feel I owe my country something. We
Yeah,
are a democracy. We
yeah,
are a republic. We have a fine economy when they don't screw it up. Uh, I've had opportunities, you know. I live a comfortable life. It's still very comfortable. We'll get to that eventually. Um, yeah, I think I do owe this
yeah.
country something.
It's good. I mean,
I also owe it my criticism if I think the politicians are screwing up.
well, that's democracy, isn't it? That's
I
how it
have
works.
not missed an election.
No, no, no. I think
Okay.
it's right. People fought hard and died so that you can have that choice, didn't they?
That's right. Yeah, the
So
only war that I don't have ancestors in is the Second World War because they wouldn't
oh
take my dad.
no, well, he
But
was
I
busy doing
had
something else.
great uncles in World War One. I had relatives fight in the Civil War and the Spanish American War, relatives who fought in the Revolution and the War of 1812, and the French and Indian War before that.
Wow.
I've had people stand up and defend this country throughout the family's history, and I'll be damned if I'm going to do differently.
No,
I'm not going to take the coward's way out.
it's a proud heritage. I mean, my family is not, professional military, but my
Yeah.
right back to the Boer War, First World War. My ancestors, they're not even ancestors. They, almost within living memory. Some of them,
Oh, yeah.
they've always answered the call as citizen soldiers, people who were called when it was necessary. They're not professional soldiers as such, but it is what it is. You got to do your bit to enjoy living the fruits of the country which the country provides, isn't it? So
Yeah.
we're slowing down.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah.
have always been, Ash, I've always been intrigued. When we moved from Chicago to Jackson, I was 5. There was a couple lived next door. He was 95
Yeah.
and he passed away. And I have been intrigued by the thought that when he was 5, he quite likely would have seen an old vet from the Revolutionary War. And that chain, I've got grandkids, once two, who will live into the 22nd century.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, children born
I
today,
mean, the chain of history is astounding.
it's shorter than you think, with lifetimes getting longer as well.
Yeah,
It's
well, there
interesting.
is that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 81, almost 81. I'll turn 81 in June. And I remember my grandmother who lived either on farms or in Spirit Lake wearing out at 72. I mean, literally, you could see it.
Oh, yeah. Life
She
was
was just
harsh.
deteriorating and she
Life was harsh.
died.
Both
And
my grandfathers died in their 50s. I'm
yeah,
54. My father's father was 54 when he died. Because
yeah.
they were coal miners. It was really, really tough lives.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah.
But my dad, he's going to be 93 next month. And
God love it.
we were working out the other day that,
Mm.
talking about the chain of history.
Yeah.
So he has known, we're trying to work out how many monarchs he knew. So he's got King Charles at the moment. He had Queen Elizabeth for 70 years. The Queen's father, I think, was King Edward the Seventh or something like that. He knew the king before him.
No, that's George the Seventh.
George the Seventh, King Edward, who was the one who abdicated, and then
Yes.
his father, I think, was King George as well.
Yes,
So
six.
my father has lived through six monarchs, and one of those was 70 years.
Yes.
And he was born in an era where the head of state was King Emperor, King of the British Empire and Emperor of
Emperor
India.
of India.
And
Yes.
and that's history. I mean, it seems like a lifetimes away, but this was in my father's lifetime, and history is much closer than you imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It is.
Anyway, so your history, let's get back to that because we've
Yes. Yes.
we've gone
Uh,
off on a tangent. So Vietnam, you came out of it, better than a lot of other people by the sound of it. What came next for you?
well, I got out of the army. Oh God. I came back to the States in October of 69, and I had over 6 months. If you had 6 months or less, they just out. But I got out in May of 70. And the interim, they actually stationed me in Baltimore at Fort Holabird, which was sort of the headquarters for military intelligence. And it's where I took the course when I got commissioned. And they put me in the DLIW, no, oh God, I've forgotten what it's called. It's sort of a research agency, but for military intelligence. Uh, we won't go into that. It was boring as hell. They didn't have anything for me to do. I had a buddy who sat there and read for several months, but he went down to the Pentagon. There's an office there for junior officers, in other words, lieutenants, maybe captains too, I don't know, but in military intelligence. And he said, I want to find out if I stay in, because again, this is Vietnam. Uh, I had a 2 year commitment as an officer. At the end of the 2 years, if I stayed in, I made captain that day. I mean, that's astoundingly fast, you know. Uh, and he said, what happens then? And by the way, at that time, retention rate for junior officers was less than 1%.
Hmm.
It scared the hell out of them.
Hmm.
Okay. They were wondering if they were going to have to turn it into a warrant officer specialty. Okay. Well, they said you will go to a 1 year career course. Well, that sounded pretty good, right there in Baltimore. What the hell? Baltimore's kind of a neat town anyway. Uh, Although Fort Holabird is right in the middle of the manufacturing section. Colgate Creek, as in Colgate palm olive,
Oh yeah, yeah.
runs through the middle of the base, and we could tell what color the soap was that they'd made the previous night by the color of the water in the creek. There's nothing quite like walking over the little bridge and looking and it's bright red. Uh, he said, and then you will either go to Vietnam or to the DMZ in Korea. And those are unaccompanied tours. And he'd just gotten married. So he's thinking, nah.
Nah.
He said, then you'll come back for 2 years. And then you'll go to whichever one of those two you didn't go to before.
They're not selling it
Well,
well, are they?
yeah. So we both got out. Turned out he was a CPA and went back with Price Waterhouse, which is a huge accounting firm, and
Mm.
did very well. I think he wound up one of the partners.
Oh,
We kind of lost track.
yeah.
Um, I went to grad school, and it was my way of dropping out. I was in grad school for 7 years.
Wow.
Got a master's, did not finish the PhD. I'm what they call ABD, all but dissertation. Uh, and it was in political science, and they were trying to be a science then, so a lot of computer work. But it's back early enough in the computer era that they were still working with punch cards. You know, so I got in on the ground floor and I got good at it. And I got married, had a son, and started thinking, I got to get a job and start getting an income. Although, frankly, I was a grad assistant clear through grad school. And I worked my way up through the ranks and was actually getting paid fairly well.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it was, if we watched our P's and Q's, we lived very comfortably.
Yeah.
Not expensively. I
Yeah.
mean, no bling or,
No.
fancy cars or what the hell ever, but I had a good used car and we had a townhouse,
Yeah. Living a
and
good
so
life.
forth. Yeah, yeah. So I wrote to the CI, to the government, federal government, um, and they interviewed me and took me
Right.
and had a clearance. Took them 18 months to do that and came down here to the DC area. See, Arlington, that Washington originally was a square, kind of a diamond, and with the Potomac River running through it, which back in the beginning of the 19th century made it really untenable. So they gave the Virginia part back to Virginia and stayed in the other part. And that part is Arlington.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're right on top of Washington, D.C. I mean, I'm living here. We can get in our car and be in the Kennedy Center in 10 minutes.
Wow. That is close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's real close, real
Yeah.
close.
It's handy.
So I went to work for the government. Um, of course, I'm a veteran. So there's some benefits there, including if you pay money, and in my case, it was only 2 or 3 thousand. You could count your military time towards civilian retirement.
Ah,
And
right.
I'm under the old system, the Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS. There's a new one called FERS, Federal Employee Retirement System. My wife's on that. Uh, and started working on my life.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm in my third marriage. My first marriage, I married in Lansing, and actually we went to Buffalo, where she's from. But with unerring emotional accuracy, I married a woman who was bipolar
Oh,
and crazy as a March hare.
right.
And it was a different sort of bipolar than my mother.
Yeah.
Hers, the manic part came out as rage.
Right.
We were married for 7 years, and I just wore out. And she told me later she wanted to divorce because it wasn't any fun. I didn't cycle. But there was my son, who's a separate story. He's a drug addict on the streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a severe diabetic, probably out of that. And that's another story for another time.
Yeah.
Uh, but I went to work. Uh, Realized I had an alcohol problem and joined a group to take care of some of that, get in recovery. Married for a second time. My daughter, when was born, uh, when she was about 2, I started having depression. And I decided it was time to address it. So I went with a therapist. I did 15 years of individual therapy, uh, mostly sorting through my childhood.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, but we did.
So that's an int I mean, you've you've said so much there to unpack, but you've touched on something which I've noticed myself in life about how adverse childhood experiences affect you afterwards. Because I do,
Yeah.
I do a bit of public speaking, and I talk on historical figures, right? That's what it's all about. I give enrichment lectures on individuals who inspire me, and I use the
Yes.
opportunity to talk about them to other people. And
Yeah.
by chance, a number of the people I've talked about who have become high functioning, highly successful, heroic figures. You know, Douglas Bader, for one, I talk about, who is a very famous World War II fighter pilot here in the UK, famous because he lost both his legs, yet continued flying as a fighter pilot and shot down 22 German fighter planes. There was another.
Thank God.
I used to be in the RAF, so I've got a leaning towards RAF. So I've got another guy called Guy Gibson, who was a wing commander, and he led the Dam Busters raid, the bouncing bombs which burst the dams in the Ruhr Valley of Germany. Both of those men had really, really traumatic childhoods. Their
Yes.
parents didn't connect with him. Guy Gibson's mother was an alcoholic single woman who abused him, beat him constantly. Douglas Bader's mother abandoned him basically as a 1-year-old child. And it's fascinating to me. And there's others I could talk about. You know, people. David Niven is a character I often talk about as a
Yeah.
sartorial icon. He had a bloody awful childhood as well. You know, he was shipped off to boarding school at 6.5 because he was getting under his parents' feet. They didn't want him around. Yet all of these people, for whatever reason, they had awful childhoods, but they used it as maybe a motivator or something to push them to the ultimate level of success in their lives
Yeah.
afterwards. Can you recognize something in that?
Yes, I do. I will tell you also, let me just add a couple of pieces. After the therapy and a few years after, I've joined a group in what's called the Mankind Project. It's New Warrior, and it's the peaceful warrior, the real masculine
Mm,
that helped also. I will tell you one thing. Uh, I would guess that in all three cases, those men reached inside themselves and found their courage. Okay. I remember being at a conference one time uh, and hearing a lady, she said she'd been a therapist for 40 years. And she said every time she gets a new client, she's always for 40 years amazed at the courage that people have of coming into a therapist's office and opening up. It takes courage. And you gotta reach in there and
mm,
find it somewhere. And then you've got to have enough courage to open up.
yeah.
I mean, I think about my father. You know, he could have used AA. My mother could have used a real therapist. Lansing didn't. I mean, God, 350,000 people in the 50s. You know, the 50s in America, in some ways, were an awful time.
Mm.
Uh, and I will tell you that sartorially, the Midwest was a desert. It was the two coasts that were sartorially smart.
Well, I
Oh,
think people
yeah,
have the wrong image, don't they, of that? Yes, of course, they think of Cary Grant in the 1950s, but the
yeah,
reality is
right.
the reason why everybody thought they were so stylish because they led such bland, really hand-to-mouth
Oh,
existence
God
lives, didn't
awful.
they? You know, my
But
grandparents in the
you've
coal
got to
mining
be,
community, they were just interested in putting food on the table, not what they looked like, you know.
yeah, yeah. You've
And
got to find that courage, and you've got to realize that you don't have all the answers.
it would be quite a thing back then as well, I think, to go to a therapist. I mean, I can't speak for America. I'm assuming it's very similar to the UK, but
Probably.
many men of that era would have had too macho a self-image to go
Yeah.
to a therapist and talk to somebody about their problems. I mean, I'm guessing most men about their problems, if at all, in the pub over a pint with a close
Yes.
friend or associate. You know, that's the
Yes.
closest they came to therapy.
Yeah. I had a friend. He's actually Irish. Um, that a few years ago I talked into going to the New Warrior training, which is very small and just beginning in the UK. He hated it. He never went. He never connected to a small group, which we have in this country. He never did any inner work. Uh, he said, "I've got friends at the pub. I can go and talk my problems over with." Exactly what you said.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's just a few years ago.
Mm. Yeah,
You
there's a lot.
know,
It's still a stigma, isn't it? Talking about mental health and
here and there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
so
I went.
your journey then. I mean, you said that you've had problems with alcohol. Was that coping with that background then? Was the drinking a consequence of the life journey up to that point?
No, I'm a genetic alcoholic.
Right. So it's
It's
inherited.
it's in the genes. My
Yeah.
father, he had an uncle who was an alcoholic. On my mother's side, my grandmother was an alcoholic. I mean, the family knew that from sometime in the early 1930s. And she lived into the late 70s, maybe early 80s, somewhere in there,
Right. So
and never did anything with it.
so drank throughout
Uh,
a whole life.
whole life drunk. Yes. In fact, my mom said she went down there. Grandpa had died at some point, heart attack. Uh, and what she found was empty booze bottles all over the house. She was ashamed to take them down to the trash. She was afraid somebody would notice the quantity of booze bottles and think she had a problem.
Wow.
Yeah.
But
Isn't that sad?
but the good news is, I know because you've already told me, it's in your rearview mirror, isn't it?
You got that right. Yeah. I've been sober now for almost 41 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's half a lifetime.
It's exactly half. I was 40 when I stopped drinking, and last year I had 40 years sobriety. So
Wow.
it's,
So there's
yeah,
a
half my
there's
life.
I feel a
I love
te
it.
I feel a teachable moment here then. So what was the point that made you sort of wake up and say, this is the last drink?
Well, I kind of fell into it. I was between marriages, my first and second. I was dating a lady who it turned out was an alcoholic. She drank champagne, cheap California champagne,
Oh, that's the worst
and
type of
vast
alcoholic because it's an
and
expensive alcoholism.
well, not if it's cheap California. Uh, and she went. I was not available, so she went with a girlfriend over to some party, and she drank enough that she went into a blackout.
Hmm.
Now, a blackout is where your mind ceases to function, but you don't pass out. You keep functioning, but you have zero memory of it and
Hmm.
zero consciousness of it. They've actually done some studies and they found out that the memory switch is turned off. Now, it's scary as hell when that happens.
I
I
bet.
mean, she said she went home, somehow got into bed, and woke up the next morning, realized she'd been in a blackout, went down, checked her car for, blood stains. And
God.
oh God, man. Yeah, not uncommon with people who have blackouts and have been
Yeah.
driving. I mean, that's why you don't want people who are drunk to drive.
Yeah.
But you have to be able to, it's an out you if you have a blackout, you're an alcoholic. Because if you aren't, you can't drink enough booze to have a blackout. You'll pass out first.
Yeah.
A normal drinker on about half that much booze will pass out.
Yeah.
Okay, so she talked me into going to Al-Anon. She went into AA.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in an Al-Anon meeting. My dad quit drinking when I was about 16. He did not do AA, he didn't do anything. Um, and since he was not in a 12-step program, there was no other change. He was dry.
Yeah.
And that was it. And this gal started talking about her uncle, who was an alcoholic and quit on his own. And she said, you know, he was a son of a bitch when he drank, and he was a son of a bitch after he quit. And I thought, Jesus, that's a description of my father. So I'm driving home from the Al Anon meeting, and Al Anon's wonderful, by the way. God, if you've got an alcoholic of any sort in your life, you know, it's a godsend.
Mm.
They don't go there and sit around and bitch about the alcoholic. They look at themselves. Why are they hooked up with an alcoholic? What do they need to do to deal with it? And it's all about them.
Mm.
But I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, you know, oh, and the uncle was also a binge drinker. And that was not uncommon because that was 83. It's much more common now for some reason. And I'm driving home and I think, you know, I drink the way my father did. I wonder if there's really a problem with alcohol that I'm not aware of.
Mm.
So I found a guy in the Al Anon group who's what they call a double winner. He's both in AA and Al Anon. And I went out to coffee with him and listened to him, told him what was going on. And he said, well, you might try doing something about the drinking. And I did. And been at it ever since.
Wow. Well,
It makes a
congratulations on that.
difference.
Many
Yeah,
congratulations.
yeah. But the whole point of doing something organized is that you work. If you're in AA, you work the 12 steps of AA. If you've worked the 12 steps, you've taken a deep look at yourself. You know,
Yeah.
first three are realizing the scope of the problem, but the fourth step says made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. The fifth step is that you share that inventory with another human being and with God. However, you conceive your higher power,
Yeah.
however you conceive that, and nobody gives a damn. What you can conceive of it as uh, the love that's in the world, or the Christian God, or Allah, or
Yeah. I get you.
whatever
I
you
get you.
want, whatever you want.
Whoever you pray
Okay,
to.
yeah. But once you've gone through that, because I've helped men go through a fifth step and I've done it myself. At the end of that, what you get is freedom inside you.
Yeah.
Okay. What you're doing is you're stepping up to be responsible for the consequences of your past and doing something about it. And that's the other one, other part. Is you must not only find the courage, you've got to find your self responsibility, which means finding your self respect, which means standing up and saying, I screwed up, or standing up and saying, I did that really well, and not denigrating either one of those,
Hmm.
you know, because we tend to. Aw, shucks. It was just, no, you did a good job there. You
Yeah.
did a terrific job.
So you took the bull by the horns and you sort of put it was your, your bête noire. You bested your sort of black dog. Um,
Yeah.
so what came next on the life journey?
What came after that? Oh,
Yeah.
God. Uh, actually, in I had finally found a church where I was comfortable. It's something called Unity. It's about as liberal as you can go and still call yourself a Christian. Power of positive thinking. Think of it. What's called New Thought, which comes out of the late 19th century. Um, And it's derived in some ways from Christian Science with their emphasis on positive thinking, without all the strictures and the rules and the dogmas and stuff. Um, and boy, I took to that like a duck to water, you know?
Mhm.
Something finally made sense. And well, it started really with doing something about the drinking. I felt like I had finally found some place where people were honest, and I had too many people in my life, including my parents, who weren't, frankly.
Right.
Uh, and I felt at home, and I
And
felt the same way at Unity.
how old were you
And
when you found that?
oh God, that would have been actually, it was the guy who was mentoring me on the alcohol who invited us to Unity. And that would have been 88, 89,
All right.
nineteen
So
eighty eight, 89.
the reason I ask is because I'm curious whether you'd been particularly religious before that point, or was
No,
it something that just clicked for you?
no. I would call myself having been spiritual, not religious.
Yeah.
And I still don't call myself religious. Regular Christians think I'm a heretic. Mainstream Christians are, I disturb the hell out of them, but that's their problem, not mine.
But it's a place where
Uh,
you found a home and a
yes,
right
yes,
avenue for you to practice faith.
yeah, yeah.
And
And
and I believe, well, am I right in saying you became a preacher?
yes, in 2000, uh, well, actually in 99, I applied for Unity's ministerial school. It's uncredited, unaccredited because it's not a standard academic program. They're teaching people how to be ministers,
Right.
which means pastoral work, how to put a sermon together that makes sense and isn't just sort of pro forma.
Yeah.
Uh, how to put a life message into a sermon, not just the Bible. Uh, yeah.
It sounds like a religion I could get on board with.
Huh?
It sounds
Well,
like a
yeah.
religion I could get on board with because I consider myself to be um
Yeah.
without a faith which I follow, but
Yeah.
I believe in humanism, and what you're describing there would be
Well,
a
there
very
you go.
humanist way of approaching life.
Yes, it is in many ways. Now, I do believe there's something greater than me. Been too many things happen in my life that I couldn't have done just out of me. Uh, and I choose not to define what that is. It's interesting. You go back to the Middle Ages, there was a theological debate and discussion on whether you could define God. Now, if you start off with the notion that God is infinite, then any attempt to define is putting a boundary and is wrong. Any boundary is wrong.
Oh, I know. I mean,
You can say what God is. You can
religion is a
say,
topic which is worthy of
yeah,
its own video, I think. And I actually know
right.
somebody who's got a master's degree in religious studies. In fact, he's a character who's been on the character on the channel, my channel, a few times. It's Timothy Crow, Big Pretty, he calls himself. He's a
Yeah.
gentleman's sort of sartorial expert from Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
I would love to get you and him and me here and perhaps have a conversation about our
Oh,
own
that'd be
take,
fun.
because he's actually spent 10 years as a Muslim within the Islamic faith. And
Yeah.
he got married. He's an Episcopalian because I was best man in his wedding at the
Yeah.
Philadelphia Episcopalian Cathedral, where I gave my first address from the lectern in a religious place last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to have that conversation because that could be
Oh,
interesting
yeah.
with our different views.
My first wife was a lifelong Episcopalian.
They seem to have
Um,
quite a liberal view as well, to be honest. I mean, they're very
yeah,
closely aligned to the Church of
they
England, I
can.
think. Yeah,
Yeah.
very similar
But
mindset.
I got a very great appreciation for the power of ritual and ceremony. in human life. And I think it's important, you know, that, and I don't care if it's something you dream up, you go out and find a lucky stone or sit under a tree and appreciate nature or sit and meditate or whatever.
No, no, I agree. You've got
Yeah.
to
Now,
have
my
something.
personal, I retired in, actually, I retired before I went to ministerial school. I took an early retirement from the government. It was getting a little too bureaucratic and boring. They put me in the wrong job. Um, so I left, you know, and that's the other piece that's interesting because my wife's 5 years younger, so she's 75 going on 76, and she's under FERS, which means you've got kind of like a giant IRA, but it's government run. And between our investments and the fact that we've got pensions, and I don't get Social Security because I'm in CSRS, Civil Service Retirement System, but she does. Our income is double what it was when we retired.
Wonderful.
We are on the bottom edge of wealthy.
Well,
So,
well, to be honest, Lynn, you've served a lifetime under the flag of your country. Whatever
yeah.
benefits you can reap from it, I think are well deserved. Decorated
Oh,
military veteran, a man who
yeah.
served your country in all sorts of
Yes.
different,
Yeah.
it's all due to you, sir.
Yeah. But yeah, we're right now active in a church that's very close. It's United Church of Christ. And I see a lot of unity influence. And unity has been around being, subversive and changing the thinking, putting the thinking out in the public. And the ministers are picking up on it because it's popular, because it's not religious rote.
No, no,
And I see that there, but I
that's
will
far more
tell you,
attractive. It's far
They
more
have
attractive.
they have a civilian up on the platform every Sunday. I do that 3 times a year: Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Veterans Day, the Sunday closest. And
Fantastic.
I go in with a navy blazer and I wear my medals. And I
Absolutely.
say something to the veterans in the congregation. Basically, I say, "Welcome home. Thank you for your service." Because frankly, if you came back from Vietnam, you didn't get that. And
No.
I grew up with world in the aftermath of World War II when the guys came back and held parades and were welcomed warmly. And there's part of me expected that.
Mm.
And we were spit on.
No, and that's been sort of well recorded in history, isn't it? Now, how the lack of appreciation affected people. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
wasn't a proud moment,
Yeah.
but
There's a couple other things come out of that. I had PTSD reasonably pronounced my first year back, and I still at times have some tinges of it. I was also exposed to Agent Orange, and there have been some medical consequences.
no, it's not been an
Yeah,
easy
type
path.
type 2 diabetes, for example.
It's not been an easy route for you, is it? So,
No.
in fact, let's get onto a more positive footing here because, I
Yes.
appreciate we've been talking for quite some time, actually, probably way over what we intended to. However, I know we're going to come back and we are going to talk about a few other subjects as
Yes.
in the future, which you haven't mentioned today because I think they merit further discussion in a
Yes.
format like this. Maybe even, more than just you and I, others as well. But I'm going to pose a sort of closing question to you. I know you want to
Yes.
talk about what it is to be a gentleman as well, but
Yes.
I'm going to ask this question to you.
I've already talked about that.
Well,
Really.
I'm going to ask you
I've
something, right?
yes.
Do you have are you familiar with the BBC television series Doctor Who?
No.
Okay, okay, all right. Well, I'll summarize it. Doctor Who is a fictional character who has a time machine,
Yeah.
right, called the
Right.
TARDIS. And he can take him back in time. He can go forward as well, but he can go back in time. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you now have a time machine, a TARDIS like Doctor Who, and you can go back to maybe the young you. I don't know, pick a time for yourself where you're 10 or 12 or whatever's a very formative point in your life where you're about to diverge into what you could have been and what you were. What piece of advice would you give to your young self which would be valuable on the life journey that you know you're about to embark upon that would help you?
I would tell my young self that he's okay, that he's good the way he is, that he's worthy, that he should be proud of himself, that his life will be good, that it will have meaning, and that once on his own, he will discover his strengths.
Great
Now,
advice.
mind you, I was aware by the time I was 5 that my mother was not right, that she lived in a fantasy world.
Hmm.
And she would pose the two of us, literally. Because I very strongly remember the incident where I suddenly realized that I was being posed. I was 5.
Wow. What do
Yeah.
you mean by posed?
Okay. We were living in Jackson, and that particular house, it was a nice house built in the 20s, uh, had a double yard, 2 lots. And the side yard had nothing in it, some big trees, and it was summer. And my mom had on a very nice summer dress. She was sitting out in the yard, leaning against a tree, reading a book, and I was playing with my little toy tractor and farm stuff. And I looked up and I suddenly realized that she had posed us in the perfect pose for a beautiful summer afternoon.
Right.
And I went, oh, and it kind of took an edge off the fun.
So it
But
was,
I
that's
went
what you
back, I
mean by a
realized,
fantasy. That's what you mean by a
yeah,
fantasy, is it that you were
yeah,
placed in a sort of fantasy tableau.
yeah. But I realized I needed to keep it up. So I went back to playing. But it was a little disappointing.
Mm.
Another time I was up visiting a buddy of mine, friend, and he was a nice guy. And they had a smaller house. Dad worked in a factory for, what was it, Months TV. They don't even exist anymore. But he was making enough money. They lived good, well. And his mother came up to him, gave him a hug while we were there. Just give him a hug. And I went home. My mother did not hug me. And I told her, I said, Bob got a hug from his mother. And she said, oh, Lynn, we have a special relationship. We don't need to do that. And you could hear the capital S and the capital R in special relationship.
Yeah.
And if I had a dime for every time I heard that come out of my mother's mouth, I'd be a millionaire. But it
Mm.
was an excuse for doing it her way in her fantasy.
Right. Ah, it's interesting. That's something, yeah, it must have, well, as you say, it did have an effect on you as a young person.
Yeah.
But no.
But I would go back and tell him that it's not his fault and that he's good and that he did not do anything wrong at any point and that he was strong and that he would live a meaningful and good life.
And history records that to be true all these years later.
Yeah.
So it was a
Yeah.
success. Oh, well,
Yeah.
thank you, Lynn. I mean, we are going to come back and speak on other
Yes.
topics, which I think will
That's
be
fine.
incredibly meaningful, a little bit more specific. But today was a journey, a gallop through your life journey, because how can anybody, in an hour or so talk about 8 decades of life? But I think people, I mean, we're going to talk about grief and we're going to talk about recovery from substance abuse in the future on, I think, 2 separate videos. So that is something to look forward to. But for me today, I mean, I just want to express my gratitude for you sharing your life journey with us today. I want to express my gratitude for your life as well, because it has, of course, been meaningful. You have given service when others chose not to, which I think is, thank you for your service, sir. And
Mhm.
yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Ash. I enjoy your videos. You're a moment of sanity in a mad world.
Thank you, sir. Well, there we go, folks. I think you'll agree. Lynn's life journey was remarkable. And of course, it continues. His life continues. Now, hopefully, we're going to do some more work together, me and Lynn. We're going to do a video maybe on managing grief, which is something he has a specialization in. He has been a grief manager, and also on overcoming addiction, basically recovery from substance abuse, which is also something which Lynn has the ability to speak with absolute knowledge and conviction. So keep your eyes open for those in the future. I'm sure they will help us all on our journeys to Chap Nirvana. And again, I thank Lynn for spending the time with me to capture that story so that I'm able to share with you here today. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up to show us that you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more, click the subscribe button. If you'd like to come on the journey with me and perhaps give me advice and tips as well, drop me an email. Drop me a comment. You'll find all of the information you need on how to do that in the show notes below. If you'd like to practically support the channel, you can buy me a coffee in the usual way, or you can become a patron. My patrons benefit from additional video content, which I make each and every week, which is uniquely made for them and nobody else. And you'll find the links on how to access all of that in the show notes below. So until the next time, take care as you go on your pilgrim's progress, and I will see you again very soon.